I was a child actor. I was telling my wife the other day that my first memory is watching my first commercial on television. So I had acted before I was old enough to remember. And my mom claims that I had demanded an agent at age 3. I don't know if anyone actually does that, but so however messed up I am, it's your fault, Mom. I was already in the arts all growing up, and I knew very young that acting was fun, but that telling stories, maybe making movies, something like that was of more interest to me. I was interviewed, an interview we still have. I was interviewed by a local television station about all my acting as a kid. And they asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. So I wanted, those were the guys, in the 80s, that's who we all dreamed of being, were those guys who came up in the late 70s and made those brilliant films and changed the industry. So that's what I wanted to do. And it was movies, but it was all, I wanted to go to USC Film School, but I also loved books. And I remember I had a whole 9-book fantasy series planned out. So maybe I'll write those next. I've always been interested in the law dramatically. My favorite show growing up was LA Law, which also had the best theme music of the 80s. But what got me thinking about it in recent years were two things. First, when you go to a school like Yale, all your friends either go into investment banking or they go to law school. And for whatever reason, the guys I was friends with, literally my top 8 best friends from college, they all went to law school and are all using their law degrees in some way today. And then my wife, Whitney, for my birthday in 2013, she got me a book by Sandra Day O'Connor, Out of Order, which is, it's not a very dense book. It's a very light, I don't want to offend the justice, but it's a light book. It seemed to me as if she was trying to write a Supreme Court history for beginners, which I very much was. But what was so fascinating about this book was it was full of all these great historical anecdotes that are only possible with the Supreme Court, like, the justice that they have to go find camping in the wilds of Washington State to consent on a habeas corpus appeal. Those kind of anecdotes you only get with the Supreme Court. And I started to think about, all the hypotheticals that could go into a confirmation process. What if there were multiple vacancies at once? How many vacancies would there have to be to freeze the court? And I found out the quorum for the court is 6. That's why I made the book 4 seats, so that when 4 of the justices are killed, the court is frozen. It can't do anything. What would happen if it was a president who's up for re-election? So half the Senate is very incentivized to make him look bad. So those were the kind of political hypotheticals that made me realize I want to write something about the Supreme Court. And then I made it an action thriller because that's what I've learned to write. Those are the kind of things I've been writing in Hollywood. First of all, the quorum of the court is 6, like I said. And so the court would be frozen. They wouldn't be able to hear any more arguments. They wouldn't be able to make any more decisions, I guess, unless they could prove that they had written finished decisions from when all 9 were still alive. But they would have to replace one right away just to get the court up and running again. And even then, they would be very paralyzed because, you're not going to be able to listen to a case on the ACA or on, the right to marriage, because that's always going to be tainted. Even if it wins 4-2, let's say 4-2, everyone's always going to say if the court was filled with 9 justices, it may have been 5-4 the other direction. So it would really be limited in how many cases you actually could hear. So you'd really have to fill all 4 seats quite immediately. And that's a big question in the first 100 pages of the book, is when is it politically right to do this? Because in the book, the 4 are killed in a terrorist attack. It's a bombing of the building that kills 124 court personnel, including 4 of the justices. And so then you get into the political problem, which is, when can the president nominate someone versus how long are we supposed to mourn? I wanted to create kind of a Da Vinci Code revelation. One thing that's fascinating about the court is that you still can't videotape the court proceedings. That all their, discussions about the arguments they're writing, all the dissents, all that original back and forth is still done by hand over paper. It's not done over email. So one thing I wanted to create was that, what if the conferences where the justices get together and they discuss the cases they've heard and they each announce how they're going to vote and they split up who's going to write what opinion, those are completely secret. But what if those conferences were secretly recorded and kept by the court? I wanted to do sex scenes because I realized, this is my second book, and I realized in releasing my first book that a lot more readers of books are women, and that women enjoy some eroticism in their books. And I think we all love it in House of Cards and in Scandal, when sex is mixed with politics. But the number one reason that I wrote the sex scenes is, after I wrote my first book, my 95-year-old grandfather pulls me aside at Thanksgiving and he says, "I read your book and it was great. I've just got one note: more sex." So my familiarity with Washington is really secondhand. I haven't spent much time here, and hopefully it doesn't show in the writing. But I do have some very close friends who have lived here, who have worked here. I have several friends who've worked on campaigns. Those are the types of people that I had read the early drafts, were people who had worked in politics or people with legal backgrounds to tear apart, the way I use the law. Hopefully no one who reads it will be able to tell. Hopefully they'll think I have an extensive Washington background. The truth is, I'm just a huge fan. I'm just a huge admirer. When I was growing up, there were 2 parts of, when I thought of DC, I thought of 2 things: coming and visiting as a kid and going to monuments and the Smithsonian, how wondrous that is. But then I also thought of all these movies I loved, like 3 Days of the Condor and The Parallax View, movies from the 70s that we don't make anymore, which are conspiracy thrillers about what the government's doing behind our back. And I hope this book has that sort of conspiratorial feeling, and I hope none of that's actually happening in Washington.